Hi, I'm Ozymandias Ramses II, and you're listening to Catholic versus Atheist.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you believe, and why you believe it.
Okay, well, let's see. I go by the YouTube handle Ozymandias Ramses II. I'm a YouTuber. I make content primarily about the subject of the Great Debate, the question of God's existence, and related topics. My background is in contemporary analytic philosophy. I specialize in epistemology and the philosophy of language in university. I'm not a professional philosopher, although I am interested in philosophy. I was an aspiring philosopher in grad school, and had the privilege of teaching undergraduates while I was pursuing a graduate degree, but I never completed my doctorate. So I'm not a practicing or published philosopher, but I'm interested in philosophical apologetics and counter apologetics. And for the most part, my channel has been devoted to addressing a lot of apologetics coming from presuppositionalist apologetics. And I've also done a fair bit of debunking of what I think are bad atheistic arguments or bad approaches within the atheist online movement.
What sort of atmosphere was in the home in terms of ideas, philosophy, religion, and talk of God?
Uh, no real talk of philosophy of religion. I grew up in a fundamentalist household. My mother was enamored with Jehovah's Witnesses. She was never herself baptized as a Jehovah's Witness, but she believed in that faith. And Jehovah's Witnesses were always sort of in orbit around our home. They were always coming by, and my mother was always involved in that kind of religious instruction. And so that was the religious instruction that I grew up with. So I grew up reading the New World translations of the Holy Scriptures, which is the Jehovah's Witness version of the Bible or translation of the Bible. That was the theology in which I was reared. I tumbled out of my faith around the age of 15 or 16. It might have started a little earlier than that. I had questions before that, but before that, I never really doubted it. I grew up in rural Quebec, which was predominantly French Catholic. So I sort of had a strong sense of being on the outside looking in when it came to religion, because of course, we didn't go to church or anything like that. So my religious upbringing was that of a Jehovah's Witness, minus having to go around knocking on doors because my mother was never baptized. My parents were separated virtually the whole of my life growing up. My father was an agnostic, I think, who leaned towards some vague theistic form of religion, but nothing more specific than that.
I usually ask my guests, whether they're religious or not, to talk about rebellion at puberty. Did you have any sort of rebellious behavior, sex, drugs, rock and roll, that sort of thing?
I was a pretty clean living kid. One of the things about being reared Jehovah's Witness is you take certain notions of sacredness and purity pretty seriously. So I didn't smoke and I didn't drink throughout my teen years. I didn't start drinking until very, very late in my teen years, in adolescence, when I was moved away from home. I had tasted beer and wine, of course, but didn't drink. I'd never been drunk. I didn't have a girlfriend until I was in my second year of university. So really very, very late start. No sexual experience except solitary masturbation in my teens, about which I was racked with guilt. And no, so I had a fairly pure, unrebellious childhood and adolescence. I suppose I was rebellious in other ways, and I suppose my parents would not say that I was completely unrebellious. But I mean, I never got in trouble with the law. I would sometimes cut classes in school and get thrown into detention hall and stuff like that. But that was more or less the extent of my rebelliousness.
Mm. Can you talk in a general way about the faith journey, if any, of any siblings you might have, and then of your wife, just to the level you're comfortable with?
Sure. Well, I have two older siblings. They're much older than I. I was an unexpected child. My nearest sibling is 14 years older than me. My oldest sibling is 16 years older than I. And in their teens, they were reared as Jehovah's Witnesses, and they practiced. But when they moved away and got married, they fell out of their faith. They, I think, are both believers still, but not in Christianity, I don't think. Perhaps my sister is. I don't think my brother is. If anything, they're probably more inclined towards some kind of vague deism. My wife is also an atheist, though she is culturally and ethnically Jewish. She grew up in a fairly irreligious household, although she has relatives who are Jewish Orthodox.
Now, can you just sort of paint a little picture of the journey that you've been on? Take us up until the present moment, please.
Okay, well, in my middle teen years, I was still a believer in the faith of the Jehovah's Witnesses. Sort of tumbled out of that around the age of 15 or 16. I moved away from home and went away to college. And at that time, because my parents were not around, I was sort of free to explore ideas without having to argue with anybody about it, except academic arguments with my peers and professors and so forth. So in college, and I went to school in Montreal at the time, so there was CEGEP at the time, so I went to CEGEP, and I had the good fortune of falling into a program. It was kind of a great books program, and I was introduced to the works of Homer and Aristotle and Plato, a lot of psychology, and of course on existentialism. And I would say sort of my first intellectual passion was existentialism, which was about as far away from the kind of faith-based Jehovah's Witness upbringing that I had. It felt enormously liberating, as you can imagine. So I became enamored of the works of Jean-Paul Sartre and the like. I read a lot of what's called existentialist fiction, but I was never very strongly politically motivated. I never fell in with Marxism or anything like that. Later, I would adopt a label of feminist because I think I naively at the time believed that feminism was simply to be understood merely as the quest for equality between the sexes. I think feminism entails a bit more than that nowadays, and that's not a label I wear now. But I was never an activist. I was never politically engaged in anything. I did a few marches and protests in my time. Marched against the invasion of Iraq years ago, and I was in a couple of gay pride parades and marches. But that's about it. That is sort of the extent of my political engagement. So no, I never fell in with any movement, and I certainly didn't fall in with movement atheism, the online atheist movement. My interest in the online atheist movement is sort of orthogonal. I'm more interested in skepticism, rationality, critical thinking, and the embracing of scientific values. That, I think, is what is best within the atheist movement to the extent that it is there. It's not always there. There's plenty of dogmatic atheists out there. So my interest in the great debate and participating on YouTube has more to do with the fact that I became enamored of philosophy and epistemology, and I wanted to inject what I thought were concepts that were relevant to the whole great debate and would be advantageous to people who are in the atheist movement that come from philosophy. For a time, I wore the label of anti-theist, and by anti-theist, I mean I'm anti-theism. I think that theism in general, on balance, is not a good thing. It offers many good things, but on balance, it would be better off without it. But unfortunately, the word anti-theism now has been adopted by people who are really just anti-theist in the sense that they hate theists, not so much theism as that they just hate the religious. And I don't hate the religious. I used to be religious myself. I don't view religiosity as a species of stupidity. I think it's just an error, but it's not a species of stupidity. And I don't think that the religious are mentally addled or mentally ill or anything like that. I've actually made a video arguing against that trope that I hear within movement atheism sometimes. So I'm sort of trying to do what little I can to nudge the online atheist movement in what I think is a healthier and better direction.
So just for fun, can you sort of paint a picture of the spectrum in the non-theist online community today?
Well, it certainly ranges. So there are people who, in the new atheist movement, for instance, whom I find very admirable. I think Daniel Dennett is quite commendable. I think Sam Harris is. And of course, they pull no punches against religion and religiosity. But at the same time, they don't malign believers, to their credit. And then there are other people who are, I think, just a little bit below that. Someone like Matt Dillahunty, for instance, is someone who I think, and I consider him a friend. I know him personally. I think he is someone who's really upped his game over the years. He's a fellow who I think is increasingly trying to be philosophically precise and accurate and more charitable. It's easy to think that he's not charitable because he has this call-in show where he gets annoyed, irritated, and hangs up on people. But I think that is as much a function of trying to get through calls and his own irritability over having to revisit the same arguments over and over and over again. So I don't know that I would do any better in that situation. But I see him as someone who I think had sort of fairly humble beginnings intellectually in this area. I think he was always a very intelligent fellow, but I think he's been trying to up his game. He's been trying to sort of read more, learn more, and I see him sort of improving in the direction that I think everyone points to in this discourse. Then there are people who I think sort of tend towards the more dogmatic. It's funny, I was just having a conversation with someone about Aaron Ra. Aaron is someone whom I admire in many ways because he's made important contributions in debunking certain kinds of what I view as lunkheaded species of creationism and fundamentalism. But he's unfortunately not very informed in philosophical apologetics and counter-apologetics. I think he tends to fall down on those, and he ends up sounding rather ignorant and dogmatic on those points. So I think he's ill-equipped to address, for instance, presuppositional apologetics, for instance, or something like my favorite, Anselm's ontological argument is my favorite, so-called proofs of God. And then there are people who I think are just a little bit too rabid. Someone like David Silverman, who I think pays an awful lot of lip service to not having any animus towards the religious, but I think he's just too politically motivated. And in fact, it seems to me he holds the religious in contempt. And then there are other figures, I mean, minor figures, who just speak ill of the religious. You know, they insist that it's a form of mental illness to be religious and so forth. And I think that's just ridiculous.
Yeah. I did recently come out of the closet as a young earth creationist. I've come to believe that all Catholics are obliged to believe in special creation, and we are forbidden from believing in any form of evolution, including theistic evolution. So we can talk about that.
That's maybe a good place to start, yeah.
I came to it through one theological argument, which is the Immaculate Conception. It is a dogma of the Church that Mary is the Immaculate Conception, and she is the one and only Immaculate Conception. And for those who don't know, the Immaculate Conception means that she was conceived without original sin, without the stain of any sin, in her mother Anna's womb, Saint Anne's womb. She is the one and only, which means that Adam was not conceived in the womb of a lower non-human animal, because before the fall, he was without sin. So if he had been conceived in the womb of any animal, he would have been immaculately conceived, because he would have been conceived without the stain of sin, original or actual, obviously.
Oh, that's really clever.
Every theological argument I've heard for special creation is more Catholic than the attempts to have a theistic evolution. For example, I firmly believe, and the Church teaches, that God created a perfect universe without disease, without death. This is a dogma of the Church. We cannot doubt that. And so how does a theistic evolutionist square that with theistic evolution? I don't think you can do it.
I agree. I think theistic evolution is a kind of cop-out middle position. It's a way of trying to reconcile an ancient doctrine with modern scientific discoveries. And what ends up paying the price here is your theology, whether you realize it or not. I mean, if story of the fall is supposed to be close to literally true, where there's no death, no disease, just all perfection in the garden, then when did that take place? When exactly did that happen, right? And if evolution is true, there has been death, disease, infirmity, mutations from the very beginning. So yeah, I agree that is. I mean, there's a kind of moderation in the religious that I don't admire. I'm sort of on board with someone like Sam Harris here. I think that Christian moderates, like Muslim moderates, for instance, end up providing an awful lot of cover for the strident fundamentalists out there. But ultimately, and this is just such an example, a lot of these moderate positions are theologically. It's not just that they're inconsistent with science. They're trying to be consistent with the science, but they do so by sacrificing something integral to their own theology. So I don't think there's any way to make sense of the fall unless you read that completely figuratively.
Yeah, that's a slippery slope. It's almost like what Jesus said, I didn't come to bring peace, I came to bring the sword to divide, you know. The more seriously I take my faith, the more alienated I have to be from the world, from my mother, from my brothers, from my sisters, from my very self, and from science, and from, or at least the consensus of science, because my religion teaches me that God is science, he is wisdom, he is knowledge, he is truth, and that he wrote the book of nature, which we examine in the natural sciences. But in terms of my confidence in the consensus of the scientific community, I have a very skeptical approach. I came to God as a skeptic. I was a radical skeptic. I was an atheist, an anti-Catholic atheist for 25 years, and my anti-Catholicism manifested more and more and more the more I read philosophy as an amateur. And I ended up being an explicit Satanist, an atheistic Satanist, but a Satanist nonetheless, and very anti-Catholic. And I actually ended up being a hard solipsist. I really thought I was the only being. And it was René Descartes, of all people, who's not exactly a poster child for Orthodox Catholicism, but he helped me out of my hard solipsism, and he launched me into faith in God the Father. And I still hated the Catholic Church, so I thought I was a de facto Muslim, but I just happened to read St. Augustine's Confessions, and then I fell in love with the Catholic Church. So skepticism is a big part of my journey, and I don't trust the consensus of the masses. I don't trust any human being. I only trust God. So this is something to take into consideration when you're scratching your head wondering why I don't get in line with the consensus in terms of the story that's being told about evolution.
Yeah, well, I think that being wary of a consensus is actually quite healthy. I think that doubt is just a feeling. I don't think it's a virtue. I sometimes hear the word doubt sort of valorized within the atheist movement in a way that I think is actually unhealthy. I think that certainty is vilified, as I think it should be, because I think certainty is just a feeling. It is just, the degree of confidence that you feel in something. It is not itself a measure of the degree of veracity of your belief set. But doubts can be unwarranted too. Just as you can have unwarranted confidence in a belief, you can have unwarranted doubts. So I think it is actually healthy to doubt consensus, and there's a good reason to doubt a consensus. That is to hold it some skepticism, simply because there's a long history of consensus being wrong. The history of science is filled with there being a consensus that gets overturned. So that's a reason to not throw in your lot with something just because there's a consensus. However, there are different kinds of consensus. There's consensus that is very strongly evidence-based, and then there is consensus that is just kind of focused. These are not the same kinds of consensus. They are both a consensus, but they're different species of consensus, if you will. And so there's such a thing as warranted consensus and unwarranted consensus. And I think we need to be highly skeptical of an unwarranted consensus, where the evidence just isn't there, but everyone goes around assuming that the evidence is there and repeating that the evidence is there. Think about dietary fads or something like that. So I'm with you when you say that you are skeptical of that. What I really call into question, though, is what you said about you only trust God and you don't trust any human. It seems to me that everything that we know about God comes to us by way of human hearsay. And even if you believe in something like the self-attesting character of the Holy Spirit acting on you or something like that, everything that you believe about the Holy Spirit, even you thinking that something is the Holy Spirit and is called the Holy Spirit or is correctly identified as the Holy Spirit, even that is something that you have heard. So every attribute that we have about God, for instance, that he is true, that he is all merciful, that he is all just, that he is all loving, he's omnibenevolent, he's omnipotent, he's omniscient. None of these things, in my view, are discovered. All of these things are merely stipulated. We are told, it is reported to us that God has these attributes. And the stories in the Bible where at least some of this can be borne out, but I think there are also contradictions in his behavior that violate some of those attributes. But even to the extent that things are borne out in holy books, it seems to me that too is a form of hearsay and coming from people, not from God himself. So what would you say to that?
Well, I don't know if you caught it, but I said that I came to God through solipsism, hard solipsism, where I was the only being well, that's what I thought, that I was the only being. And so if I'm wrong when I say that I'm not God, then I'm not wrong because I'm God and God cannot be wrong. So this is sort of my reduction to absurdity proof that of course God exists, of course God is good. So this brings us, I think, to presuppositionalist apologetics. Can you just sort of introduce the pros and the cons, the pros from their perspective and then the cons from your perspective?
Sure. Okay, well, let's distinguish presuppositionalism from other types of apologetics. So someone like Thomas Aquinas, who produced 5 proofs of God, the argument from contingency, the causal argument, and so forth, or someone like St. Anselm, who produces an ontological proof of God. These are all arguments that are based on the world around us. They point to facts of the world, right? These are evidential apologetics. So you're looking at the world and the nature of it, and you try to infer something, try to arrive at some metaphysical conclusion.
I don't think the Anselm's ontological argument is a posteriori. I think it's a priori. It's
no, it is a priori, but yeah, you're right. But it's still that's not an evidentialist. But it's a classical apologetic. So Yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but you're quite right. Anselm's ontological argument is not an a posteriori argument, that is, that looks at the world and then tries to infer something. I'm wrong with that. It's a priori. Okay, but so these are all classical apologetics. So evidentialism is a form of classical apologetics. A priori arguments, like Anselm's ontological argument, are also part of the classical repertoire of classical apologetics. But the idea is we're sort of going to exercise our human reason, and we're going to look at the world. We're going to try to figure out a way of proving God. This is a very traditional Catholic approach. Protestants, of course, took this up as well. But more recently, primarily in the Calvinist camp, people like Cornelius Van Til and his protege, Gregory Bahnsen, John Frame, and others, have taken a different line. And the idea is this. You can't actually prove God by looking at anything in the world or by considering a particular concept. Rather, you have to understand that everything that exists in the world exists because of God. God is sort of the ground of all being. He's the substrate of everything. He's the cause of all causes. And nothing would exist but for God. And they take from that nothing would be intelligible without God. In fact, the intelligibility of the universe is itself a mystery that needs to be explained. I mean, why is it the case that the world is intelligible to us? Why should our brains, our little chimp-like brains, why should they be able to apprehend reality and actually discover truths about the physical world? That's kind of interesting. We are, all of us, walking around with concepts like truth, falsity, logic, mathematics, that the world is apprehendable, that there are laws of nature, for instance, that there's such a thing as beauty, for instance, that there is such a thing as morality. These are all concepts that we employ every day of our lives. But according to the presuppositionalist, you are not entitled to utilize those concepts, rationally speaking, unless you can discharge those. There's no way to rationally discharge those. There's no way to make sense of that talk. Yet we all make sense of this talk. So the idea is that if you're an atheist, there is missing from your conceptual apparatus the way of making sense of all of these kinds of talk, all of these areas of human discourse. And therefore, there must be a God. That's how the argument goes.
Yeah, it's kind of like two fish are floating in the water, looking at each other, having a conversation. And one of them wants to prove to the other that this thing called water exists. It's kind of a ridiculous conversation. It is a little bit mysterious. If you don't have a relationship with God, you don't know who God is. It's a little bit mysterious when I talk about loving this God and how you have to love God. It's the only way to have lasting happiness. But that really is the bottom line. It's not about the intellect. It's about the will.
Yeah, well, certainly presuppositionalists would be inclined to agree. I mean, they believe that there's no such. I mean, they tend to be Calvinists, right? So part of Calvinist doctrine is that
no free will.
Yeah, and that also that there's no such thing as a genuine atheist, right? They believe that the evidence of God is everywhere, and consequently, people such as myself are merely professing to be atheists, and we're doing so because we're in love with our sin, but we don't, in fact, don't believe in God. We, in our heart of hearts, know there's a God, and we're just being hypocrites. All I can try to do is assure you that it's not the case with me, but I don't know if you'll make an exception in my case. But it seems to me, from the inside, it seems to me like I genuinely don't believe in a God. The reason is, I mean, I laugh when I say that because it's easy for me to say it, and the reason it's easy for me to say it is because I can remember fairly vividly what it was like to actually believe in a God and to think that it was ridiculous to imagine that there wasn't a God. I mean, I simply could not understand. I could not, I was a theist, I could not put myself in the shoes of an atheist and imagine what it was like to not believe. It just seemed to me preposterous. I mean, how could anyone be so foolish as to believe such a thing? This is one of those things that really makes a lot of people in the online atheist movement committed to being in the online atheist movement and to being anti-theists. It makes people bristle to be told, you actually do believe. In your heart of hearts, you do believe. You're just a liar. You're just a hypocrite, and you're just in love with your sin. And you're either doing this self-consciously or you're just oblivious to your own motivation. And the allegation of sort of being oblivious is actually the milder, more charitable one. But even that is rather galling. So I find myself laughing when I hear it because I can well remember what it was like when I thought that way myself. But all I can do is assure you that I genuinely don't believe that there's a God. There's no part of me that is afraid that I'm going to go to hell or that imagines some surveillance system in the sky that sees all my actions and is judging me or anything like that. None of that. Now that all seems surplus to requirements. There was a time in my life where I thought that was absolutely necessary to have a coherent view of life, to have a view of life that was infused with meaning, to be a moral person and to be motivated to be a moral person and so forth. All of that seemed absolutely necessary. But now all of that just seems like a weird metaphysical Rube Gold machine and is completely metaphysically extravagant. And anyway.
Can I try a thought experiment on you just briefly?
Yeah, by all means.
I don't know if you're familiar with the famous story of the Titanic.
Yeah.
But as far as I understand, and for the sake of the thought experiment, let's just go with it, even if it's not historically accurate. As far as I've understood, a lot of people died that could have been saved, but they just didn't take the tragedy seriously at the time because they were living it up in the first class lounge, eating, drinking, dancing, and the band played on. So whether that's historically accurate or not is not really my main point. Let's just go with that image. And this will be a thought experiment where you are eating and drinking and it's late at night and the band is playing and you're hypnotized by all the pleasures of the flesh that are around you, the beautiful women in their nice dresses and the music and the food and the drink and everything else. And this ship was billed as unsinkable and the pamphlet is there in your hand and you can see it. The Titanic is unsinkable and so on and so forth. And I break in because I've been told by the captain's stewards that we've hit an iceberg. We have to get into the lifeboats and get off the ship. So this is the image I like to use. I do love you. I do respect you. But I most of all express this love and respect by urging you to get off the sinking ship and to get into the lifeboats. You do sympathize with theists that take that charitable approach, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I used to be one of those people. And I would hope that you would sort of assume I'm being charitable too when I say, listen, I try to disabuse people of their religious views. I mean, I don't ruin Thanksgiving dinner by saying, there's no God, right? But I mean, if the subject comes up, I'm happy to have a conversation of why I think there isn't God and why I think Christianity is just, another false religion and so forth.
The one last issue I really wanted to touch on with you was the question of free will. I think that the main reason that atheism is absurd is because it forces the thinking atheist, or what I would call the pious and devout atheist, to abandon free will and thereby abandon reason, science, justice, love, morality, and everything else. What do you say about that?
Well, there certainly is a tendency for atheists to embrace hard determinism. And I'm sort of in the majority camp here. Most philosophers, that is the majority camp among philosophers, I'm a compatibilist. So I don't believe in libertarian free will. I don't think that makes any sense. So the idea of compatibilism is, look, we're going to grant that physical causal determinism seems to be true based on all of the evidence. That is, as far as we can tell, all the physical stuff in the world operates according to strict causal principles. We are physical systems, including our brains, and our brains appear to cause minds. So presumably our mental lives are similarly caught up in this causal matrix. And so everything that we think and feel and say and do is itself the result of physical causes. Nevertheless, we can maintain non-deterministic talk and talk about free will because we can distinguish between different kinds of variables that control us, variables that are outside of us versus variables that are within us. So I'm a compatibilist. What that means is I think that determinism is true, but we can still talk about decisions and voluntary versus involuntary actions, constrained versus unconstrained actions, thoughts that issue from our personality, for instance, as opposed to thoughts that issue from, say, a pharmacological cause or something like that. So in other words, all my thoughts and actions and feelings and so forth are caused, but the nature of the cause, the specific character of the cause, distinguishes when we would say that an action has been voluntarily or involuntarily. And that's what we mean by free will, is that distinction, really. And so the whole idea of holding people responsible, we all know that if you tell a person, you tell a child, I'm going to punish you if you do this, chances are that'll affect the likelihood of the child doing or not doing something. And if you promise that if they behave while they're in the restaurant or while they're in the store, you'll put in a good word to Santa so that they get the present that they want, it increases the likelihood of the child complying with your commands. So any talk of responsibility and accountability, I think, is really us just exploiting the fact that the incentive structure that we provide for people can modify a person's behavior in very, very predictable ways. It's how we train animals. It's how we rear our children. And it's how we get people to be polite and civil, and it's how we have a civil society.
Yeah. But in principle, if we were to examine this mechanism of compatibilist freedom, would we find that there are uncaused natural causes there? Or do you think that it is all 100% herd determined? And if it is 100% herd determined, this mechanism of free will, then you've got a herd determined free will, no? Which is a contradiction.
No, no, it's not a contradiction. It's just that free will is being redefined here. So to answer your question, there's no mechanism going on in the brain where free will decisions or voluntary decisions are going on that is different than the others. Right? Ontologically speaking, it's all just going on in the hardware. It's all going on in the plumbing of our brains. It's all happening in the wetware. Okay, and we don't get to control that. But there are things that happen in our brains that we associate with ourselves. That is, that we identify as expressions of our personality, of what we're like, of our character, for instance. And then sometimes something happens where it's completely out of character. Not even out of character, you didn't even deliberate about it. No part of you that you identify as any part of you was the cause of a certain action.
So you are an apple tree. Let's say that you're not a human, you're an apple tree. When your apples become ripe, at a certain level of ripeness, you let them fall to the ground of your own free will. But when little Johnny comes and picks one of your apples, that's not your own free will. Is that the sort of definition of compatibilism? You make that distinction between the natural internal mechanism by which you let your apple fall to the ground versus the outsider that comes and forcibly picks one of your apples. Is that a good analogy for compatibilism, that distinction between inner world, outer world?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't fully capture it, but yeah, that's actually, as a first approximation, that's not a bad analogy. But let's sharpen it up a bit. Let's imagine that you have a person who looks at young children with lust, 4-year-olds or something like that, right? And that person is very unfortunate. That person does not decide what they find arousing. None of us decide. I mean, I'm not attracted to men. I don't look at men and go, wow, what a hunk. I'd like to sleep with him, right? But I look at women with plenty of lust and desire, right? And I have no control over that. I didn't decide to be this way. This is just how I am. And similarly, a person who looks with sexual longing upon a child does so equally helplessly. But now let's imagine that this person has decided that they want to act on this, right? They cultivate this desire, surfing the internet, looking at kiddie porn and stuff like that. They're frequenting playgrounds and stuff like that. And they are sort of cultivating this, what they recognize to be in themselves an unwholesome attraction, right? And they know which direction they're going in. They're feeding this, right? Well, that's where their will is engaged. They are clearly deciding to do this, right? Nevertheless, they are not deciding to have that longing. And there are even causes of their momentary decisions when they decide to surf the internet for kiddie porn or something like that. Even that is not something that they have decided to do. They didn't decide to decide it. They decided it, but they don't decide to decide. And that's the paradox for some people is that you can decide something, but you don't decide to decide it. It's you who's deciding. You have to understand that you deciding something doesn't mean that you could have done otherwise. And that's the what I think is incoherent about libertarian free will is it's this idea that you could have done otherwise. But the problem with this doctrine of you could have done otherwise is there's no way you could ever know that that's the case. You can't rewind the tape of life, play it again, keep every molecule in place on the same trajectory, and imagine that all the causes are exactly the same. The outcome would be different. That's called contracausal free will, and that's part of what's wrong with this idea of libertarian free will. Is we have a tendency to imagine that all of the causal variables could be exactly the same, and yet you could decide otherwise. But wait a minute. What would account for the decision otherwise? And you'll say, well, the agent. No, but what is it about the agent? What's going on in the agent that causes this? Right? And the problem with free will is that it is in fact not an explanation. It's a pseudo-explanation. It's not even a mystery because it imagines this problem of contracausal free will that you could do something that literally violates the laws of physics. Because if you were to replay the tape of life and there was a different outcome, you'd say, well, wait a second. Something's gone wrong here. We've got, identical causes should produce identical effects. And that is why people are moved towards hard determinism. So I'm a hard determinist, but in the sense that I think that all causes have, rather all effects have antecedent causes. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a category of causes that we associate with the person as stable features of the person, and are the result of mechanisms within the person that allow it to govern itself, and are not, they're not constrained. They're not, there's no external constraint on the person. It's all happening internally, and those are the ones that we call your deliberate actions, your voluntary actions. Just think of the difference between voluntary and involuntary actions. Just imagine the difference between lifting your leg and having your leg kick up because a doctor has tapped you right below your kneecap with a rubber mallet, right? There's a distinction there that is genuine.
Yeah. When you were talking about the pedophile, it was 100% Catholic. Everything you were saying was 100% Catholic. It is not a sin to be a homosexual. It is only a sin to cultivate that disordered proclivity. I just want to mention that. So at the end of my interviews, I do ask my guests to close the show. Something positive, a message of hope. So just to wrap up, what do you think you might be able to say to anyone that's out there listening now?
Wow, I feel really put on the spot. Okay, well, I guess it's going to sound a little trite, but honestly, what I'm most interested in a great debate is having civil conversations of the sort that we've had. And I think that really one of the best things that a person can do is try to put some distance between themselves and their most cherished beliefs. I think that sacredness is important. I think we all have sacred values. We all have things that we value most highly, higher than anything else. Those are our sacred values. They are inescapable. Everyone has them. Nevertheless, one of the most pernicious things that happens with people is that they surrender to how much they value these sacred things, and they simply are uncharitable in how they approach these conversations and how they approach other people. So when you are charitable with other people in discussions, when you just don't fly off the handle, when you don't vilify and demonize other people, when you try to be empathetic and understanding them, it actually feels good to have such conversations, even with people where you hated everything that they said, and they might have mistreated you, right? But here's some of the wisdom of turning the other cheek. It is, in fact, restorative. It makes you feel better about yourself. You don't go away seething and in a rage. So I think that courtesy, civility, they are not just epistemological norms, they're norms of civil discourse, but they exist not just to smooth relations between people. They actually will sort of calm your soul. So I really enjoyed this conversation. I enjoy conversations of this type. I would encourage other people to fight with themselves and make themselves be civil in these conversations, even when you can't stand what the other person is saying. Just resist the urge to be censorious and to vilify them and demonize them and be uncharitable and assume the worst about them and assume that you know what their motivations are. Just try to apply the principle of intellectual charity. Assume the other person has good motivations and the other person is at least as intelligent as you are. I think that the benefits that it will bring to you are enormous.
If you like your worldview, if you think it's swell, if you got some questions, ask me and I'll tell. All you got to do is ask. All you got to do is ask.